Well, this is a very, very common topic. It's a common assertion when one gets into debates. Um, you start getting into debates about the utility of certain government programs, and eventually the ethical nature to whatever extent there is even such a thing as ethics of government finances becomes into question. And the common libertarian claim that taxation is theft or itself a crime is usually countered that this is a incorrect characterization of taxation, and that taxation is actually more like a payment for services, that you're paying the government for the services it renders. So it's an exchange, it's a fair exchange, and that if you don't pay your taxes, that is akin to freeloading, that you're basically stealing from the government. And so it's actually unethical to not pay taxes, rather than the libertarian idea that it's unethical to tax. And I think that I agree that the idea that taxation is theft, but I think that you have to be able to defend that more rigorously than to simply reassert it over and over and over again. I'm increasingly in favor of consequentialist arguments, not because I reject moral or ethical arguments or because I think that they're wrong. I think the libertarian ethics and morality are very consistent and they're very useful, but I think ethics and morality ultimately are judged on their consequentialism. How effective are they? I could come up with this, hypothetically, I could come up with a very, very coherent, consistent theory of ethics, and if the resulting conclusion of that theory was that we should murder everybody, or that the planet should become, a wasteland of some type, then people are not going to care whether or not there was a consistent approach in formulating those ethics. Even if they can't prove any fault in the logic, they're just going to say, look, at the end of the day, that's going to be suicide, so I'm against it. Likewise, to just say, it's theft, it's theft, it's theft, it sounds like you're just a broken record, and you're just trying to keep asserting it. So the important thing is to break down how to differentiate government finances, and there's a couple different ways government finances itself, but taxes are really the base of it. I mean, even the lending is based, when government borrows money, it's based on the assumption, well, it could be coercively borrowing, it could be going to people and saying, you're going to loan me this money, in which case that is essentially taxation. But most of the borrowing the government does nowadays is voluntary, although most of it's coming from the Fed, so it's kind of like it's lending to itself, sort of. But the reason a lender is lending to the government is because they believe that they will be able to get the funds back in taxation. When I borrow money, the lender will basically want to know what my income is, how I'm going to be able to pay it back. Well, how is the government going to be able to pay something back? Nowadays, it's because of taxation. Now, there are cases in history where there might be different alternatives to taxation. So a king in Europe, in the Middle Ages, might have been able to get a loan saying, I'm going to go, let's say, and crusade in the Holy Land, conquer the Holy Land, and if you loan me 60,000 pounds of gold, I'll go take over Jerusalem or whatever else, and I'll be able to, through direct loot and plunder, which again is not that distinct from taxes, but I guess hypothetically it's a little bit different. Circumstantially, it's a little bit different. Then I'll pay you back that way. But that's how they pay it. The other way is through inflation. That's indirect tax, as Ron Paul likes to say. They're taxing away the wealth of people's money. So I think the problem with the idea that taxes are just an exchange is that it involves an awful lot of equivocation. The reason this is coming up is because in one of my other videos, I did a video called Deregulation Caused the Crisis, about how that's a fallacious idea that the collapse in 2008 is a result of deregulation. And I've been having a very long comment debate with somebody, and it hasn't been real intense. It's basically he and I, one comment a day kind of deal. And eventually we came to this point, and he just said it's absurd to consider taxes theft because you're paying the government for services. And the most obvious retort to this that I can think of is, when was the last time you got a tax bill that itemized your use of government services? Indeed, is there any relationship whatsoever to use of government services and the amount of taxes you pay? Because clearly there is not. I can say in my personal experience, and a lot of people say they like me using personal anecdotes. I think they're valid because, my experience is not that aberrant for most people when it comes to things like paying taxes and having a job. Well, it's aberrant compared to a narcopac who's never had a job, but beside the point. When I was younger, when I was a child, I had no income. I generated no income whatsoever, and yet I was intensively using government services. In addition to all the cliched ones like roads, I was attending government schools, which required a government salaried employee to basically be babysitting me to one extent or another for 8-9 hours a day, plus the entire infrastructure to maintain that, plus the transportation, because I didn't always ride buses, but it was pretty common. I'd say at least 50% of the time I was in school. And this was the situation I was in, not for 12 years, but for 13. I was actually held back a year when I was after kindergarten. I more or less failed kindergarten, had to take what was called junior first, and then first grade. So 13 years. And towards the end of that, of course, I did get a job. I got a job my sophomore year in high school. And so only at that point did I start actually earning an income. Prior to that point, it was only consumption. Only consumption. And that's only the last, 3 years. So for the first 9 years, and again, this is not counting all the other quote-unquote government services that I was using, defense or whatever, I paid nothing. And my parents, you could say my parents paid, but my parents didn't pay any more than anybody else. We have next door neighbors to this day who are childless, who never had children. I believe the woman is infertile and never really talked about it. Nice neighbors, nice couple, never had children. They paid exactly the same taxes as my parents did, who had 2 children, and exactly as much as the parents who had 8 or 9 children. They paid the same amount of taxes. So, my parents did not get more or less of a tax bill because they had children. In fact, it's actually a write-off, and so they probably were getting a smaller tax bill because they had children, which is kind of one of the weird... I don't know the net effect of all the subsidies the government does do, because in some ways they encourage child rearing, and in other ways they discourage it. But and measuring that would be really, really difficult. But I never got a bill. Now, when I finally started to have a job, at the point when I was actually contributing something to society, albeit not a great deal, I was working in fast food. I wasn't performing some great function, but you work in fast food, you give people the option to get a meal on the go, and that's actually a useful, valuable thing to some people some of the time. Then suddenly I started to have to owe taxes. Now, it wasn't very much, and it certainly was not covering the cost of the quote-unquote services I was receiving. There's no way the amount of income, even if 100% of my income had been taxed, it would not have paid for my likely slice of government services. And this trend continued. Well, it became really, really obvious with me because eventually when I started working in oil and gas, it was a little bit slow at first, but my income rose substantially. In fact, it increased by a factor of 10 in about 2 years. And my use of government services has not gone up. It has gone down because I have left school. I have left primary school, and then I went to college. And of course, college is subsidized by the government heavily, not as directly as much as the K-12 kind of school is. You don't have, because you do pay some out of pocket. But I finished doing that also, and my job does not require any increased utilization of government services. In fact, sometimes it requires far less. The videos that I do in Utah, I live on a basically a tiny little city run by the oil company, where even the utilities are owned and operated and provided to me for free, or I guess included in my service to the company. Free water, free electricity, free phone service and internet and all that kind of stuff. And true, at some levels that stuff does require some government because they get the water and stuff by shipping it on the roads, but not very much. And there's no connection there. When you get your tax bill, there's no, well, you drove this much, you used this, and I mean, it gets even more absurd when you have people on welfare. They're receiving big checks from the government. They're receiving subsidized housing. So they should have a bigger tax bill, but they have a smaller tax bill. So there's no connection whatsoever between use of government services and what you have to pay. What you have to pay is based on whatever the government decides. The government sets the tax rates and the tax brackets and the tax categories and the fees and whatnot, and they're the ones who decide. And they don't make those decisions ever. Even they don't even pretend that those are based on use of government services. If anything, they invert it. That's what the whole point of progressive taxation is, to invert it. There's kind of an idea maybe that the richer you are, somehow the more you're utilizing government services, but there's no empirical basis for coming to that conclusion, and it's certainly not the case. The closest thing I can think of is gas taxes, saying, well, you're using the roads, and gas taxes pay for the roads, and so the more you drive, the more gas taxes you pay, and that's supposed to be some kind of valid proxy, but it's not. Again, I actually have an atlas of all the financial expenditures, all the technical government data for my state, for the state of Michigan, and I actually fucking read the thing. I actually also have the comprehensive annual financial reports for my state and several other states. I remember Alex Jones a couple years ago was big on comprehensive annual financial reports, which you can get for free by calling the states and saying, I want this, and they'll ship them to you, which I guess counts as a government service. Anyway, I was looking at them, and I grew up in a relatively rural setting. There's a town of about 10,000 people that I lived on, not in, but near. And one thing I learned about the roads by looking at the atlas was that different types of roads require a different amount of money to operate per automobile mile. So large freeways, like the big 4-lane circuits that go around the big metropolises, or the main thoroughfares that kind of string across parts of the countries, those cost something like 10 times more to operate per mile that each car drives on them than the simpler 2-lane highways. It's a 2-lane road. It's basically just asphalt and blacktop laid onto a flat bed. Now, where I lived, that's what all the roads were. They cost something like 9 cents at the time. I don't know what it is now because the atlas is old. There's been a lot of inflation, but the ratio is about 10 to 1. Back then, they cost like 9 to 10 cents per mile. The major roads were costing something like $1 a mile. That includes the cost of building and then subsequent maintenance. But the gas taxes were the same for everybody. So in a sense, I was subsidizing people who were using the more expensive roads. I was not getting a reduced tax rate because I was using poor quality roads. And it became even more obvious to me when I started working in oil, when I started driving on government roads that are not maintained, so-called seasonal roads that they expend little to no money on keeping maintenance on. So like today, I'll spend 2 hours driving. About half of that will be on a highway. The other half of that will be on unmaintained roads. My 2 videos ago, I made a video on government roads with these very roads in mind. These are roads that are not maintained very well, and some of them are not maintained at all. And do I get a discount? Is there any kind of, when I go to the gas pump, can I say, hey, I'm not driving on the really expensive freeways, which is responsible when it comes to, and altruistic if we're talking about in terms of congestion and saving people time and causing accidents because of too many cars. But there's no way to do that. There's no end. It's a flat tax on the gas, totally irrelevant to to what kind of roads you're driving on, what kind of expenditures the government's put on. So even there, that proxy doesn't work. And that's, to my mind, to my knowledge, that's pretty much the closest of any tax is to being a fee for services. So your tax bill does not have itemized services on it. If it was a fee for services, you would have the choice to go through it and say, okay. And Irwin Schiff, the tax protesting father of Peter Schiff, was fond of saying, you don't owe income taxes, but if you want to pay for something, go right ahead. And he was talking about a scenario where you go to the IRS and be like, look, I looked at the federal budget, and I don't use the invasion of Iraq, I don't use the invasion of Afghanistan, I don't use all that welfare that you pay for people to have children out of wedlock and to not work and to get onto drugs and to go get food stamps to go get drunk with. I don't use any of that stuff, and quite frankly, I'm against it. And I'm not against, of all the government programs. And he basically says, so, I think that only about, 20-30% of the federal budget is actually services that I actually use and favor. So I'm going to write you a check for that much, my share of that. I'm not going to write it for the whole thing, because those are not services for me. They're not providing me anything. You're producing them, but I'm not asking you to, and you're not producing them for me. So why should I have to pay for them? If taxes were simply a payment for government services, then you would have this right. People, they like to use. I've heard this analogy used many times. Like, well, you can't just go into a restaurant and walk out without paying. It's like, there's an awful lot of conflation and equivocation going on there, because the analogy does not hold very well. For one, restaurants are specific locations that you have to actively go to. No one is born, or other than extremely exceptional circumstances, nobody is born in a restaurant. And if they were, I highly doubt there's ever a restaurant that then demanded that the baby owed them anything for it. But if someone can find a news article that happened, I'd be happy to read it. You go in there and you specify what you want. You look at the menu and you say, I want this and this and this and this, and it's implied that you will pay for that. But you have selected you have specified what you want, and then they serve it to you. And then there's a whole issue in restaurants where if you are unsatisfied with anything, the etiquette of the waiter or the waitress, the cleanliness of the facility, the specific cooking characteristics of your food, is it to your liking, you can complain. Now, there's no guarantee that you will get it, but most establishments are very, very they're very, very open to refunds, to redoing it, to taking it off the bill. I've had stuff taken off the bill and I didn't even ask. I just, they come and say that was a little late, or I'm kind of picky. Like, I like my hamburgers with only ketchup. I know it's boring, but that's just kind of the way I like it. And they'll come and it will have onions or something on it. I say, I don't want onions on these. And I'd be willing just to take the onions off. They throw it away and give me a new one, and then they don't charge me. I mean, it happens. I don't know of that ever happening with the government, where you can say, hey, listen, that education that I paid for, I didn't learn anything. So can you just take that off the bill, or whatever? That whole, subsidizing Israel, I just don't see what that's doing to me, or subsidizing Israel's enemies. I think that's maybe counterproductive, and just go ahead and take that off the bill. You don't get to do that. And if we're going to do a really good analogy, a government restaurant, so to speak, is one that includes like an entire society that people don't voluntarily enter but are simply born into. And then the restaurant produces whatever kind of food it wants, regardless. It doesn't ask you what it wants. Maybe it lets you vote on who the head chef is, but it doesn't ask you to order specific food. It will give you some kinds of food. If you don't like it, too bad. You can choose not to eat it, but you can't you can't ask for more. They're just going to tell you no. And they're going to charge you for whatever they feel like. Not what you specify from the menu, not what you agreed to. There's no you pick something out and then it's implied you pay. They pick whatever they want and explicitly tell you that you're going to pay. and they can pick whatever sum that they want. And that's what a government restaurant would be like. That is, and this is where the equivocation happens. Are there certain similarities? Yes, there is an exchange that happens. That doesn't equivocate the two. That doesn't mean that they're identical morally. That the process involved is identical. And if we want to stick to consequentialism here, whatever the morality is, the utilitarian incentives in a system where one party gets to unilaterally dictate what the terms of the exchange are and enforce those terms regardless of the wishes of the other party, the incentives for corruption and for abuse are astronomical. There can't be a more terrible incentive structure for that one can formulate, because they get to decide what the terms of the agreement are, which is not, again, you don't get to dictate price to to producers when you buy stuff to them. You can ask, and you can haggle. It's not always possible, but if you don't like the price, then you don't have to pay. I mean, the other day, my engine light came on my car. I was about 1,000 miles over doing an oil change, so I thought maybe that's just it. So I went to the place and said, no, you need a new catalytic converter. But they didn't just come to me and say, well, we put it in there and here's the bill. They said, well, that's what you need, and so, do you want to have it done or not? I mean, they asked, do you want to have it done, which is not something the government ever does. Do you want to pay these taxes? They never, ever ask that. And I could have very easily said, no, I don't want it done. I want to have it done someplace else, or I don't want to have it done at all. I have 2 cars. I could have just said, you know what, I don't need this car anymore. I'll just drive it till it dies. That's or I'll say, you know what, I have a buddy who can probably get it to me cheaper, or I just don't have time right now, or any number of reasons I could have given, and they wanted to say, well, it's too bad, we're going to do it anyway, and then we're going to charge you whatever the hell we feel like. That would be the government muffler shop or auto repair shop, but it's not. It's a market one, and because it's a market one, they aren't guaranteed to get my money, so they can't be such horrible douches. The incentives are different for them. Could they try and fleece me? Could they lie? Yes, they could potentially commit fraud, and it does happen. But there's the countervailing force that doing so runs the risk of being discovered and then suffering market consequences because of that. That is, government can suffer consequences for what it does, but it's a much, much, much higher barrier. They are insulated from the negative externalities of their decisions much more than any company, even very large, powerful companies, unless, of course, that large, powerful company is itself defended and protected by the state, which, again, is a problem resulting from states, not from free markets. So I think, the equivocation that, since there was an exchange, it's basically the same thing as buying and selling, and it is totally wrong. Taxation is extortion based on the pretext of exchange, but that's not service. Service is when both parties agree. This is I think it comes from a guy who has a podcast called the School Sucks Podcast. His name is Bruce or Brett Vanette, something like that. I don't listen to his podcast, but one time I heard him speak this out, and it made perfect sense to me. Service is when both parties agree. If only one party agrees, then it's not a service. An exchange may happen, but it's not a service. If you don't value what you're getting, if you're unwilling to pay for it, even if you did value it, but you didn't value it at the price offered, then it's not a service. If a man comes up to me and says, "I'll shovel your driveway for $20," and I say, "You know what? I really would like my driveway shoveled, so and sure, I'd have it." Then he's providing me with a service. If on the other hand, he comes and says, "I've shoveled your driveway, and now you have to pay me $20," and I said, "Well, you didn't ask me. I don't really care. I don't need my driveway shoveled, or I can do it myself, or whatever." There's any number of potential reasons I could give for not needing my driveway paved at all, let alone for $20. Then he hasn't provided me with a service. He has simply done something and then used that as a pretext to take my money. A popular example would be squeegee men, other kinds of people who kind of just jump in and say, "I'm giving you this, now you have to owe me." That's exactly what the government does. And that's not a service. That's not payment for services. That's just they're going to take what they're going to take, and then they're going to say it's okay because of the quote-unquote services they give you. But they're not even services. Such a huge part of the budget is military. None of that's a service. that's a disservice to me. Most of the rest of it are social welfare programs that have terrible, terrible, at the very least, unintended consequences. I think some of the politicians I have more cynical views about, and they actually desire this. I'm sure there are Democrats who want black people to be poor, who want them to be poor so that they will be on welfare and that so they'll vote for Democrats. I'm sure there are some who want that and that they laugh themselves to sleep every night for the poor people who vote for them. Most, I don't think, are that politically astute or overtly manipulative in their political philosophy. Maybe I'm being too nice there by saying that. But even so, the unintended consequences of doing things like paying for children out of wedlock, for paying for medical care, which drives up the price and creates a monopsony on the seller and makes the producers all conform to the will of the actual payer, who is the government, not to the wishes of the actual consumers who need the care, is disastrous. And so these aren't services to me. These are things that are harming me. And I don't have the option to discount them from my tax bill. I could say, okay, fine, the roads are run pretty shitty, but I do fucking use them. So how much of the budget of government goes to roads? Okay, I'll pay that much. Even for now, just ignoring the fact that, I may not use roads that really require the lion's share of government spending. But I don't have that option. There's no, it's unlike, it is unlike any other market transactions. I could have walked away from getting a catalytic converter. I can walk out of a restaurant. I can say this food is shit. I'm not. If you go any fast food restaurant, you take your food back, they will give it to you back. Or if you throw it away in front of them, I'm not eating this, they will refund your money. Now, if you eat it all, I remember there was a guy who used to come through Burger King all the time, and he would always buy chicken tenders. And he came by one night and he said, "Hey, I want free ones because the other ones were too cold." And the manager was like, "Okay, fine, that's great. Give me the old ones back." And he goes, "Well, I ate them all." And he goes, "Well, they must not have been too cold because you ate them all." So yeah, but how is it? It's not really analogous to government because he drove up there in the first place and explicitly asked for them. So I think this is really, really absurd. I don't think that it stands any scrutiny unless you're going to say, well, there's a similar aspect here, and there's a similar aspect in taxes and government, because there are exchanges that happen. There are government provided goods and services that pretty much everybody will at some point use at least a little, and you are paying them for it. And on the market, you pay people and get services, so there's something similar. So there's a similarity, but then that somehow becomes an equivocation that they're equal, and that's totally outrageous. What about all the dissimilarities between the two? This is similar to Ankatavad, who's saying, well, property is theft because, or the anarcho-syndicalists who say property is statism because there's certain similarities. Sure, there are certain similarities, and then there are differences, so you can't equivocate the two. And that's what it is. When someone says the taxes are just like an exchange for goods, then that's an equivocation. Now, there might be a problem here in the accuracy of language, although that's really something that could be said of pretty much any discussion whatsoever. There's a little bit of ambiguity here. Maybe we need a word for something. There's extortion, there's service, and maybe we need a word for something that is an amalgamation of the two. But even if there isn't, or even if we come up with one, clearly the service is one thing and the extortion is another, and government provision of services based on taxes are not the service. They're on the scale towards extortion if they're not far enough there to actually be called that, which makes them ethically and morally, and any consistent system, less ethical and moral. Consequentially, they're much more problematic, because when you give a certain party the right to extort even a little bit, then there's an incentive for them to abuse that. Now, the only kind of way around this that I can think about is for them to assert that you actually, whatever the government says, because I could say that those aren't services to me, so I'm not paying them. They could say, no, whatever the government tells you it's giving you, that is a service to you, whether you think it is or not, and so that's why you have to pay. Again, this is not analogous to any other service. You can't go like to a restaurant and have them tell you what you're going to order. You get to decide what you're going to order. So that is not analogous to that situation. Also, it's a little ridiculous. There are so many government programs and so many government expenditures. I doubt there are anybody, even among the left, even among the liberals, who literally believe that every government program is worth the tax money that goes into it, let alone the individual share a given person pays for it. So the only argument that would make that valid would be say, whatever the government says, then that's what it is. And I think that is, to me, that's obviously giving the government way too much power, because then it can just assert anything. It can say, we're taking all your money and we're going to use it to build a giant gold swimming pool for Congress. And by that argument, then they would be correct. There would be no way to say, no, I don't think that's actually a service or a valid use of tax money or whatever. And that's the only kind of justification I can think of that would be able to say these are actually services that you do need to pay for. So this is very annoying. It really, I think the reason it's such a slapstick argument is because people did not come to favor taxes because they thought up this idea and they thought, oh, it's just like they formulated that, oh, going to restaurants and stuff that would make taxes right. Well, what I think is really happening is it's reverse engineering, where they favor government programs, and so since they realize taxation is required to fund them, they decide that taxation just on utilitarian grounds in order to get what they want from the government is required, and then they work backwards from there. How am I going to justify this act somehow? And they come up with these ideas that really don't. I mean, they're doing all kinds of gymnastics to try and make it fit, and it really doesn't. And at the end of the day, I think even if you can show them that taxation is theft, that's not going to change their mind, because they're going to make the lesser of two evil arguments. They're going to say, oh, wait, so what? So what? We need government anyway. That's the reason they came up with all these weird arguments in the first place, is because they were trying to justify something that they already viewed as positive. If you show them that the justification is wanting, and it clearly is, then they're just going to say, well, okay, fine, it is evil, but it's bad, but it's a necessary evil. This is the reason why the gun in the room argument is not sufficient in most cases to change people's mind, because they view if we didn't have a government, sure, that would government's violence, but we'd all immediately become homicidal, and the murder rate would be greater than the hundreds of millions who are killed by government. It's a silly argument, but that's what people like to make. That's how people rationalize it, and so I think that's why it really makes a lot more sense to say, look, the ideal, the efficacy that you have for government in the first place, the idea that you think that it's a good idea, that this is a useful institution that's bettering society, regardless of how it's funded, is erroneous. The social welfare programs, which is the main thing that that liberals on the left, especially people on the left, they see social welfare programs and they see that's good, that's making society better. Depending on how left they are, they may even think that's the only positive thing about society. They're moderate lefters. Oh yeah, there's good things on the market, and competition's okay, but there are others that the only redeeming characteristics of the society are government programs, which is interesting. This is where the anarcho-syndicalists fall. The people who are supposedly anarchists, the only things that they think are great about society are government things, and everything that's non-government is dubious and destructive and counterproductive. I think it's much. It's not easy or anything. There's no simple solution here, but it makes much more sense to say, look, the programs that you're talking about do not help the poor. They don't help blacks. They don't help women. They don't help the family. They don't make anybody richer. The minimum wage doesn't help the low income. Blah blah blah. And that's where economics becomes so important, because that is where you make that argument. That's how you have those. That's how you swim in those waters. And economics is value free. There's no ethics or morality in economics, and you just say, okay, you think the state is good because it does these things, but it really doesn't do the things you think it does, and the costs are very high. We don't even have to go down the road of, taxes are based on theft. Although that's icing on the cake when you get there. Once someone has become, receptive to the idea that government programs are ineffective and that they are counterproductive, even, then suddenly the idea that taxes are theft, whatever. If you don't favor the government programs anyway, or they're not very efficacious, then why not consider it theft and just throw it out with the window? And I think I've always had more luck with that. I've tried the whole taxes theft, gun in the room. People don't go for it, but you start saying, okay, let's look at Obamacare and what it does. Let's look at why healthcare is so expensive, and it's so obvious the government has played, not solely, but has played such an enormous role in making government expensive, which obviously hurts everyone, but it hurts the poor the most. That's what we should be concerned about. And I just use that as an example, but we could be talking about welfare. There's lots of great books about the government getting into welfare. Charles Murray's Losing Ground and The Tragedy of American Compassion come to mind first. There's probably a whole hell of a lot of other ones, though. Public education, oh man, that's a huge issue. But you can go into it like, look, public schools cost more and more money. They have lower and lower results. They cost more than private schools. They cost way more than home schools. There's no indication that they increase literacy, that they're doing a good job. The cliche that, if we just had it in the market, then the poor people in inner cities would not get educated. Look, I was in an education program in college for a long time. Everybody knows that inner city kids are not getting educated. Nobody believes that they're getting educated. Everyone, and it's kind of just a big question is, why aren't they getting educated? And it's always racism, or it's because of slavery or whatever. It never occurs to them that we're already throwing huge amounts of money from the school. But if any serious, honest assessment of a government program is going to reach the conclusion that it's a very dubious quality. It's a very dubious efficacy. And so focusing on those details to actually look at them is going to bear more fruit. Now, the problem with that approach is that it's not so broad. You can look at welfare or healthcare and just really break that down, and that's not going to extend to breaking down the related systems. I mean, there are principles involved that will, but most people do not spend a lot of mental energy thinking in the abstract like that. And so the moral arguments are simpler. They can be universally applied, but then people just dismiss them because they think there's all this the weight of consequentialism kind of overrides whatever consistent moral insights can be derived at or deduced. So everybody that I've been able to convert to ANCAPism in real life, it's always been a system of, okay, we're going to talk about the roads now. Now we're going to talk about healthcare. Now we're going to talk about the schools. And at some point, you don't have to go through everything, because a tipping point eventually occurs. A tipping point eventually occurs, and like, okay, there's a pattern here. And the problem with that is that it takes a long time, but that's the only way you can really do it. Now, the gun in the room arguments, those do resonate with some people, and they do work with some people, so it's not like I'm saying we should never use them, or that they... Look, I mean, you should be as armed as possible and have them both. And somehow this video became not about what I was originally going to do it, but it's related and still valid. So what the fuck? I'll do it anyway. But with the people, and I've converted a couple people in real life. That's how I've done it. And that requires law. I mean, some of these guys, one of them, it was over Facebook, and it was back and forth for a long time, and these were long messages. Here's a 5-page paper about this. Here's a 5-page paper about this. Here's a 5-page paper about this. And you have to be careful when you do that it's even worth the effort, that it's somebody who's actually receptive and not just talking past each other, because then you're just wasting your time. You have to learn how to disengage and be like, this person is so far gone that at this point there's no reason to even pursue it. Maybe someday they'll grow up. Maybe someday they'll have a visceral. People need, and this does happen. They get viscerally screwed in some way, and it's like, oh yeah, maybe I'll listen to you now. A couple other people I just talked to, hey, I'm in town. Well, let's go have dinner or lunch. We talk, and we'll talk about, and it's kind of like for a while. One guy, every time he came up with a new one. Well, what about World War II? Well, what about? Oh fuck, that reminds me. I got to do a World War II video too. I'll do that later. Not today though. Tell me about this. And after a couple months, not intensively, but just every couple weeks, having lunch or dinner with this guy, he was like, you know what? I think we should do capitalism for everything. And also in the process, he became much better versed in making utilitarian arguments than he otherwise would be. Much more knowledgeable, have much more knowledge, a much broader knowledge base, and so he is now a better advocate. He is somebody who is able to convince others, and he was not an intellectual guy. I'm thinking about one guy. He's kind of like my pride and joy in terms of my personal life. I wasn't friends with him or anything. We had a mutual friend, and he came over, and I was bashing FDR, and he's like, FDR, he's the greatest president ever, and we got in an argument, and he was persuaded, and now he goes and tells all his friends, hey, blah, blah, blah. And he's got he has several of my books, and then he ends up loaning them out to others. And yes, it took a long time, but it actually bore fruit. And it's still bearing fruit, and that guy's going to be bearing fruit for the rest of his goddamn life. And so am I, and so are some of the people likely that he's going to convert. And I hate that word, but it seems the most appropriate at the end of the day. I don't know of a better one whose zeitgeist has changed. That's even worse in terms of convert. But anyway, 40 minutes. It's not the longest, but it's not the shortest. I played with the settings on my camera again. In my previous video, I set it to the maximum pixels, and it made it a little bit choppy. People were saying that it was tripping them out. That was common to everybody. It just came out that way. This one, it looks like it's okay. It may be a little choppy, but I don't think I saw it freeze. But if it doesn't work, I'll move on to another setting. But anyway, that's it, and I'll talk to y'all later.